In this lecture, I'm going to show you how to add login to our application. So if you look at the console on Firebase, on the left side, we have this authentication page. Here we have 3 tabs: users, and this is where we can see all the users registered in our application. We can also add users, we can delete them, we can reset their password. So Firebase gives us a very simple dashboard to manage our users. Now here, the second tab shows all the sign-in providers that are supported in Firebase. So we can add email and password authentication, phone, Google, Facebook, Twitter, GitHub, and anonymous authentication. By default, all of these are disabled, and we need to enable the authentication methods that we want to add in our application. In my other course, Build Enterprise Applications with Angular, I covered Facebook authentication in detail. But in this section, I'm going to touch on Google authentication because it's simpler to implement. Now in the future, you can always come back here and enable another authentication method like email and password and add it to this application. Simply adding a new authentication method is not going to change the architecture of your application. It's a nice thing to have. So the approach I'm going to take over the next few sections is to build a foundation for this application, and then we can always add new things to this foundation. As a metaphor, think of a building. When they want to construct a building, they don't build the first level with all the little details like power outlets, lights, and so on. First, they build the skeleton, the architecture, and then they gradually add additional features to each level. We're going to take the same approach when building software. So here I'm going to enable Google authentication and save the changes. Beautiful. Now currently we're assuming that the user is logged in, and that's why we're displaying this drop-down menu here. But for anonymous users, we want to have a separate link here called login. So back in our navbar component, I'm going to duplicate this shopping cart link and then rename it to login, and also change the address here, login. Before going any further, let's make sure this works. So here's our login link, and this takes us to the login page. Beautiful. Now later, depending on the authentication status of the user, we're going to show only one of these links, login or their username. Now let's go to this page and add a button to log in with Google. So let's go to login.html. I'm going to add a button with 2 classes, btn and btn-primary, and call it login with Google. And here we want to handle the click event and call the login method in our component. So let's go to our login component and implement this method. Now to implement login, we're going to use one of the classes in Angular Fire. But Angular Fire is simply an abstraction over the Firebase library that we installed in the last section. At the time of recording this video, Angular Fire has limited support for authentication. So in some cases, we're going to work directly with the Firebase library. So on the top, I'm going to import everything from Firebase and give it an alias as Firebase. Now with this Firebase alias, we can look at all the functions and objects defined in this library. So anywhere in our code, we can type Firebase dot, look, we have these functions: app, auth to work with authentication, database to work with our database, initialize app, which we use for initializing our application, messaging for sending messages in the cloud, and storage for storing files in our Firebase storage. So this is our Firebase library. Now we should also import Angular Fire auth from Angular Fire 2/auth. Now we need to inject this into the constructor of our component. So private AF auth, and the type is Angular Fire auth. Now my auto import plugin imported this class one more time, so that's why we have this compilation error. I'm going to delete one of these import statements. Okay. Also, we don't need this on-init interface. So let's quickly clean up this code. Okay. Now we're ready to implement the login method. It's very simple, only one line of code. So this dot, we use this Angular Fire auth object. This object has a few properties. We're going to use the auth property. And this object has a bunch of methods related to authentication. For example, we have create user with email and password. So if you want to build that kind of authentication, you're going to use this method. In this video, we're going to use Google authentication. So we call sign in with redirect. So this is for implementing OAuth. It's going to redirect the user to one of the OAuth providers like Google, Facebook, GitHub, and so on. Now, as the argument here, we need to pass an auth provider object. Note that this object or this class is defined in Firebase library. And here's one example that we need to work directly with Firebase. That's why we imported it on the top. So in Firebase, we have different authentication providers. So firebase.auth.look, we've got email auth provider, Facebook, GitHub, and so on. Here we need to pass a new instance of Google auth provider. So Google auth provider, and we need to new it up here like this. Now you might ask, what about dependency injection? Mosh, didn't you tell us that we should never new up objects here? That's true. We shouldn't really new up objects here, but later in this section, we're going to refactor this code and extract this into a separate service. Then we'll inject that service into the constructor of this component. In that service, it's okay to new up this object here because this is about implementation detail. That service is responsible for handling authentication using Firebase. Okay? So this line of code is all we have to write to implement Google authentication. Now let's test this. So let's go to our login page, log in with Google. This is redirecting me to Google authentication. So I'm going to log in with programmingwithmosh@gmail.com. Add my password. And now I'm successfully logged in. Now shortly, we're going to modify this application and show or hide this login link here. And we're also going to display the currently logged in user's name on the navigation bar. But for now, to confirm that authentication actually worked, let's head over to Firebase console. So back here on the authentication page, on the users tab, you can see we have one user. This is my identifier. I'm using Google provider. This is the date I created my account, the date I signed in last time. And here's a unique identifier for this user. So in Firebase, every user has a unique identifier that is represented using UID. Next, we're going to implement the logout method.